welcome to the Sun Sphere, a 266-foot high hexagonal steel truss structure topped with a 75-foot gold-colored sphere served as the 1982 World's Fair symbol as a monument of the sun. Towers over the city of Knoxville, borders the Smoky Mountains, currently housing 2 event floors for any special event you can imagine. The 4th floor observation deck is open and free to all guests that want to learn more about the Sun Sphere and the city of Knoxville, Tennessee.
Here we are. Well, welcome to everyone. Thank you for being here for our first ever virtual edition of the annual Women's National Book Association's and Southern Festival of Books Coffee with the Authors event. Usually it's in the morning and we're drinking coffee, but I hope you've got your coffee or tea or Diet Coke or whatever else. It's 5 o'clock somewhere. And thank you so much to our key sponsors for making this event possible. I want to get this right. Metro Nashville Arts Commission, Ingram Content Group, Tennessee Arts Commission, Vanderbilt University, and Parnassus Books. Quick note, there should be links being posted in the chat at some point to buy the books from today's conversation from Parnassus. And there should also be a donut button. There should be a donut button, but I mean a donate button, posted if anyone wants to throw a little extra support at the festival. That's what keeps it free. On that note, let's jump in. I'm Laura Philpott. I am a writer living here in Nashville, and I have the delightful job of introducing today's guests, starting with, and I hope this makes her appear on the screen, Brit Bennett. There she is. Hey, Brit.
Hi.
Hey, so this is actually our second on the record conversation. Brit was a guest earlier this year on Nashville Public Television's A Word on Words, where we got to talk about her phenomenal new novel, The Vanishing Half, which, following in the footsteps of her prior book, The Mothers, has taken the world by storm and, oh, by the way, was nominated for the National Book Award. Congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And next up, we have Samira Ahmed. Let's see if she appears. There she is.
I'm looking for the donut button.
Why isn't there a donut button? That's what's going to happen at the
That's
next
what's missing in virtual events is the donut button. Let's get that.
Get a donut button. Samira is the author of Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know. Tell you what, hold your book up for me if you don't mind, if you have it nearby.
I do.
There you go.
That's why I'm by my shelves.
I love it. You may know her from her 2 previous bestsellers, Love, Hate, and Other Filters, and Internment. Her books are wildly popular with both adult and teen readers. And Samira, as we were discussing in the green room, you have lots of fans here in Nashville, here in the WNBA.
Nice.
And
well,
also...
I'm a fan of Nashville and all my friends down there. So hi, everyone.
And finally, see Pam Zhang. She's going to appear. There she is. Author of the debut novel that knocked me absolutely sideways, How Much of These Hills is Gold. Pam, if you've got it, hold it up. Readers, you may have seen it on Late Night with Seth Meyers. Maybe you saw it when it was Gwyneth Paltrow's first ever book club pick, or maybe you've just heard me yelling about it everywhere I go. So now we are all gathered. Since we have so many book clubbers in attendance at this event every year, one of our goals is always to leave everybody wanting to choose these books to discuss with their book club. So if I may, I would love to start this conversation having each of you give us just a quick 1 or 2 minute overview of your book, what it's about, who the characters are. And Pam, if we could start with you, then we'll go Samira and Brit.
So How Much of These Hills is Gold is my take on reimagining the American Western, but through the eyes of 2 children of immigrants, people that I didn't see featured in books like Laura Ingalls Wilder's works or in John Steinbeck's works when I was growing up and reading them as a kid. So the book starts off with these two children who discover that their father, their last remaining parent, has died in the night, and they're in this western mining town at the end of the gold rush where they're very inhospitable. They're sort of run out of town. There's a gun that goes off, and they're on a quest to bury him. And that's where it begins.
Thank you.
I'll go next. So Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know is what I call my smash the patriarchy, eat all the pastries, history, mystery. And it follows a story of two young women, 2 centuries apart. And the young woman from today is trying to unravel this mystery of a reference to a Muslim woman living in 19th century Paris, who's referenced in letters between Eugene Delacroix, the painter, and Alexandre Dumas, the writer. And so we have her story as she's sleuthing through sort of the archives of Paris with a dashing young man who happens to be the descendant of Alexandre Dumas. And then we also have the story of that mysterious 19th century woman, and we see the two of them unfold and meet sort of metaphorically on the cobblestones of Paris.
Thank you. Brit?
Hi. So The Vanishing Half is a story of twin sisters who are inseparable as children and then decide to live their lives in 2 very dramatically different directions. One is a white woman and one is a black woman. So it's kind of a family saga. I suppose it unfolds from there, and you see the implications in the lives of these sisters as they take these very different paths, but also the ways in which their choices trickle down to their own children.
Thank you, Britt. And I'd love for you to kick off responses on our next question as well. But quickly, I'll add for everyone watching online, if you have questions, please feel free to type them in the comments on whatever platform, wherever you're watching, because we'll be able to get to some of those in a bit. So feel free to ask your questions for that part. And Britt, would you tell us a little bit about what started this story for you? If you were to trace it all the way back to the very beginning in your mind, was it a character or a place or a scene? What started The Vanishing Half for you?
Yeah, this really started with place, which is, I think, the first thing I've written that started with place. But it started with this town, Mallard, where the book begins and where part of the book is set, which is this community of light-skinned Black people that are very color-struck and invested in keeping their community as light-skinned as it is. And it came from a conversation with my mother where she was telling me about a town like that she remembered hearing about as a child. So it started with the sense of place, the idea of this town that has these very toxic values, these very insidious values, and thinking about what it would be like for these characters to grow up there, to leave that town, and also to later return to it.
Thanks. Pam, how about you? What started How Much of These Hills is Gold for you?
Sort of my 2 answers, the answer and the real answer. The real answer is I don't really know. I woke up one day and I had like an image of two children and 2 silver dollars and I actually thought it was a short story. And then it just kind of came back and annoyed me and realized it was a novel. But I think that when I look through my subconscious, I do think it was all these years of reading these great American Westerns and great American epics and realizing at some point I never thought anybody like myself or my family reflected them.
When someone gave me the galley of your book early on and they handed it to me at the bookstore and they said, "Oh, this is a book I think you should read. It's set in the American West," I almost pushed it back at them. I was like, no, I don't want to read a story about the American West. And they said, no, trust me. And I'm glad I did.
So I understand that impulse. I still sometimes wake up and like, why did I write a book that is a Western? Like, why did I write this book? Because like it's nothing like the short fiction that I wrote before.
But it's so different from anything else set in the West. That's what I love about it. It's nothing like anything else I've ever read set there. Samira, how about you? What was the first thing in your mind that started this book?
Well, this is actually basically inspired by my bachelor's thesis. Wow. So finally, an English major gets to put their bachelor's thesis to use. I was like, yeah. I wrote my bachelor's thesis on romantic Orientalism, and as I was sort of thinking, that was sort of always like in the back of my mind. And I was in Paris I have family in Paris, so I go pretty often. And I was looking at this Eugene Delacroix painting for maybe the millionth time. It was The Battle of the Giaour and the Pasha, which is based on this Byron poem, which was the inspiration for my thesis. And I was thinking so much about how, both in Romantic Orientalism, but just generally historically, and even in our time today, the stories of women are just buried or lost. And, whether it's women, very famous women, or women who maybe potentially could have been famous, or who have created amazing art or had scientific contributions, or, really anything. So many of their stories are buried by patriarchy and are forgotten. And so that was kind of what was my inspiration, which is that I wanted to fictionally pluck out this story and have a young woman from today unearthing the story from the past, but also seeing how patriarchy still has this very sort of toxic role today.
There's a line at the beginning of your book that struck me as like a line that could just be the theme that ties all three of these books together. And it's, "Welcome to my life of constant code switching." And I honestly, I think like that's a theme for a lot today, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that idea, the idea of code switching, not only in your book, but also as it relates to the lives of your readers. How is the idea of code switching something that's relatable to young adults these days, do you think?
Well, I think maybe even
Uh-oh, did we lose Samira? Are you there? All right, Samira might be frozen for a minute, but hopefully she's coming back. We're going to come back to that question later. Brit, I'm going to come back to you. I think of you as such a writer's writer. I know you love to challenge yourself and write stories that go beyond just simple dichotomies like wrong and right. And I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about the aspects of writing this story that felt new and different from what you had done before, or what challenged and excited you the most about writing The Vanishing Half.
Sure. I think, it challenged me in a lot of different ways. My debut novel was a sort of linear coming of age story. It was very contained in time. This story very much felt outside of time in a lot of ways. It felt like, it was this kind of weird non-chronological story, and that there was kind of a fracture in the timeline because there was a fracture in the family, and these characters were living in different time zones, it felt like. So it challenged me in a lot of those ways. It was a bigger story. It was a more sprawling story. It was, I think, a lot more complicated thematically. But I think that's what excited me about it, was I knew I didn't want to write the same thing I had just done. I wanted to challenge myself to learn how to handle, okay, you wrote a story that took place in 10 years. Now here's a story that's taking place over 40 years. What are you going to do with that? And here's a story that's not linear, and you're going to have to try to locate where you are in time and locate the reader where they're moving in time. All of those were things that were daunting, I think, at first. But I was glad that I took on that challenge, because it felt exciting to learn how to write a different type of book that I did not know how to write at the time.
It was fun to read. I could tell like that you were having fun writing it.
Thank you.
Samira, you're back.
Sorry about that.
It's when you don't get
I was just like referencing, I
must
must have like called on something, because I was just referencing social media and the internet, and then I went out. I don't know.
You pissed off the internet,
I guess, sorry. So I was saying, with code switching, especially for young people, I think we live in such a world. I mean, if you're a young person of color, you are very much used to the idea of code switching, whether you use that language for it or not. Especially if you, like me, were, say, growing up in a household where you were speaking a different language at home versus outside of the home. And that's like a very literal code switching. Or even just culturally, if you're coming from a background within your home that's different than, sort of quote unquote normative majority culture. And I think for young people, especially now, our schools are now majority minority, our public schools. And our systems have not reacted to that. We still are living with, and kids are engaging with systems that are, decades and decades old. And so I think every kid has to kind of navigate different worlds. And so often, even just your growth and like the teenagehood is very much about having a foot in different worlds. And so I think kids are naturally excellent code switchers. From in school and out of school, from different cultures, and even within school cultures and within school like social milieus, and how kids will sort of intermingle between them. So I do think that code switching is always an interesting, thing for me personally to write about. It's just very much a potent part of my life, but also for young people, it's a way that they're navigating the world. And I think that especially for a young person, when you're a teenager, you're just like sort of forming your politics. And I think how you both absorb things from those different worlds or those different milieus, and also, just what you're reading and learning so much affects how that politics is formed. And that in turn, spreads its sort of tentacles out into your different groups, or the different sort of entities that you're sort of code switching between, or cultures. So I think it's just a really interesting topic generally, but it's especially, I think, interesting for when you're writing for young people.
Yeah, it seems timely. Pam, I've got a question for you, but if you can hang on one second. Brit, I wonder, would you speak a little bit about code switching as it relates to one of the twin sisters in particular, Stella?
Yeah. I don't even know if I would think about it as code switching, because what she so Stella is one of the twin sisters who decides to pass, and I guess there's an element. I guess I think of code switching as going back and forth, and really for her, that's the opposite of what she's trying to do. She's trying so hard to commit to this white world that she is joining, that code switching would sort of reveal that would expose her. So I think that a lot of what she is doing is actually resisting that, and trying to perform whiteness in a way that seems convincing to would appear convincing to people in the outside world. But I think for me, what was fun about writing this character, who is sort of writing whiteness from a Black character who is passing as white, it's sort of this weird kind of, I'm on the outside and I'm looking at her, and she's on the inside, but she's also on the outside. So there were like weird, I think, levels of trying to think about how she would be moving in this world, and how she would be trying to perform whiteness in this way that is continually, she performs in a way that's always kind of wrong. It's always kind of inappropriate, because she performs whiteness as she experienced it as a Black woman. And that is not what is appropriate when she ends up becoming a white woman herself. So there were a lot of sort of, I feel like I'm talking in circles a little bit, but that was kind of like the sort of thorniness of trying to navigate all of this as I was writing it, of thinking about how is this Black woman who grew up in the rural South and then eventually makes her way into wealthy white community in California, how is she performing whiteness based on what she has experienced, which is different than the way you perform whiteness when you live in Brentwood, So a lot of the book, I think, was trying to navigate the thorniness of that, and trying to kind of throw my voice across like several layers to get to where Stella is very uniquely positioned within this white world.
Yeah, well, you did it really well. There's so many heartbreaking scenes where she's comparing herself to her neighbors in that California neighborhood, and trying to, adjust her gestures and her clothing and everything else so that she matches, and she's performing the whiteness just right in the same way that'll blend in.
Yeah.
Pam, we were talking with Brit earlier about how it was fun for her to write something different. Something that just kept occurring to me as I was reading How Much of These Hills is Gold is this had to have been a fun book to write. You tucked all these little surprises into the narrative early on that just sort of detonate throughout the book, and you've subverted expectations about what is a book set in the American West. Was this a fun book for you to write? And if so, what did you enjoy most about it?
It was fun to write initially. So I wrote the first draft very, very quickly, and that was exhilarating because I felt like I was being pulled along by discovering what was happening to them. Yeah, it's an adventure story in many ways, and that was exciting. I will say that subsequent revisions were not so fun, and I think something like 15 or 20 for this book. I think that after every revision, like the sort of like emotional difficulty of presenting these characters to children, right, who are very raw in the way that they experience the world because they haven't sort of formed that crust that adults learn to form. I ended up crying every single time I did a review. I don't know, yes and no. It was really fun, but then I think like revision is really like the heart of writing, and that was a little less fun.
Yeah. I fully recognize that saying writing a book is fun is a crazy thing to say. It was a fun book to read, though. It was just the way you tuck those surprises in and the moments that they would come out. I think that's one of the reasons it sort of took everybody by surprise and by storm. It was just a delightful reading experience. And you kind of touched on this, but this is a question for anybody. Hardest part of writing this book, or the biggest challenge you had to get over, or a detour that you went down, or mistake you made, or chapter you had to throw away. We have a lot of aspiring writers in our audience for this event, so people love to hear about mistakes and how you came back from them. And while you're thinking about that, I will mention to the audience, anybody who wants to put in a question, feel free to type it, whether you're on Facebook or you're on the whatever platform. Those will be fed to us, and we will get to those in a minute. Any good mistakes we can learn from?
I don't know if this is a mistake, but for my first two novels, I wrote them both fully in third person first and then switched to first person, which is a little bit of a pain in the butt. It's not just like changing it from like she to I or whatever. And then for my third novel, I was like, I'm going to start this in the first person because I know what will happen if I try to do it in the third person. And then I also did, for me, matching up the two narratives, because if you shift something in one that's 2 centuries earlier, the shift has to be reflected in the contemporary one. And so I literally had just a giant piece of paper with just, like when you do those timelines when you're in like 6th grade and you're learning about just with each thing plotted in different. And I'm not really a great plotter. I was like, why did I choose to do this? But and I was like already in. I was like, I got to finish it.
Got to do it. Got to find your way to the end. Brit or Pam?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I don't even know where to start with mistakes. I feel like most of this book was a mistake as I was working on it. I think as far as, I guess, difficult things, to me, the structure was the hardest thing. That trying to just kind of move the pieces of the story around in a way that didn't look like I was moving those pieces around. And I think also when I got to the part, I knew I was beginning with these two characters that would separate very early, these sisters to separate early in the book. And when you write a book like that, there's an expectation eventually that there's going to be like a convergence of some type, like I don't think you're expecting those characters just to go off in their separate directions forever. Like you're waiting for it to circle back in some way. So to me, it's always that moment of the book that's really difficult, where you have these like beats that are expected because you both want a surprise in the way that you deliver that or how you navigate it. But at the same time, there are things that you're expecting when you're engaging with something. It's like you're watching like a romantic comedy. Yeah, you're expecting someone to kiss, like you're expecting something like that to happen. So I don't want to be so much of a contrarian that I'm like denying you that thing that you're expecting, but at the same time, I want to deliver it in a way that feels surprising and exciting. So to me, that was the difficult part of the book, was figuring out how am I going to make these stories converge in a way that's not, the twin sisters run into each other in an airport or something, something like that, a way that felt organic and true to who these characters were, but at the same time, just doesn't deliver that in a way that felt cheesy and convenient.
Mm-hmm. Pam, this was your first book, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes and no.
Okay. What do you mean?
I was ruminating on my answer to this, and I think I have to kind of agree with what Brit was saying, which is like there are too many mistakes to count. But in a way, I suppose as like a writer, I resist calling them mistakes because I truly do you that with a novel, you have to write, and my publicist used to say this, but you have to write like a huge pile of cash in order to get to the good stuff. And then it's just, my novel is, I don't know what the final draft is, like 8,000 words, and probably maybe 5,000 of them, and those are the same words. That's the first draft. I threw out so many points. I destroyed the entire characters. I think those are all the process of finding out what your novel is going to be. I think with a novel, it's hard. You have to think of it as this sort of like thing that when you start out on page 1, if you know exactly what it's going to be like on page 200, then that novel is dead in the water already, right? If it doesn't have its own process of discovery built in, it isn't going to be successful. But then that also means that by the time you get to page 200, 300, you're like, oh shit, now I understand something about my novel, and I have to go back and fix everything up until completion. I think that with every single draft, as it becomes clearer to you, as it shows itself to you. So I have a drawer novel I wrote before this one that was just like a pile of mistakes I had to make, and yeah, I think it's so much a part of the writing.
The drawer novel. Samira, we've had a question from our audience, a follow-up on what you mentioned earlier. They want to know, did your editor suggest the shift to first person, or did you make that decision on your own?
So my first book, Love, Hate, and Other Filters, went on sub, meaning my agent took it out to editors in third person. That was novel that also had like a main narrative, but then also had intercalary chapters that weren't a total second POV, but just sort of smaller interstitials. And one of the editors who was wanting to take it to acquisitions just said, well, have you tried it in the first person? I was like, no, I didn't. And then they were kind of like, well, can you just try like for 30 or 40 pages to do this in first person? Because I think it would actually make the novel stronger. And I was a little resistant, but I was like, okay, 30 or 40 pages I can manage. It's not that much. Let me see what I can do. And then I started doing just those 30 pages, and I could tell immediately that the voice of the main character, Maya, was really shining and coming through much, much better. And I think for young adult fiction, there is a lot of first person because they want, young people want sort of that proximity. And it just was better. So I was like, okay, I guess I told myself I'm going to try it because whatever, it's not going to kill me to do it. And if it works, maybe it's going to be for the better. So yeah. And then for my second book, Internment, I again wrote it in third person. I guess because I'm very old school and I really love third person omniscient. Like we don't really have that much more. I mean, now third person is usually generally pretty close, especially in YA. But I'm still like, one day somebody let me write a third person omniscient novel somewhere. So I wrote Internment in third person. And then as I was looking through it, I was like, I think it would sound better in first person. And so then I told my agent, like, stop, wait, don't send it out. Let me just try it. I did 3 chapters in first person. And then I sent out like those 3 chapters, both in first and third, to beta readers. And everyone was like, not even close. It's so much better in first person. And I was like, dang it. That's what I thought.
There you go.
Now I have to do the whole thing again.
I'd love to talk a little bit about your books as physical objects. When the drafting is done, when you've gotten the manuscript finally where it's going to be, and the book it's kind of on that track of belonging to readers. It belongs to your publisher for a moment, and it has to get a title and a cover. What was that like for each of you? Is the book that we are reading, does it have the title that you put on it, or was it a title someone else put on it? What are your thoughts on your cover? We can go in any order. Pam, if you want to go first, since this was your first book published.
Yeah, this is the title it's always had. I think they used to have the word "and" at the beginning, and that was the only thing we dropped, which I agreed with. Titles usually come to me like pretty early in a process, so I haven't had any difficulty with that. I will say, the first time I saw my cover, we had a lot of struggles getting the title. I love the cover. I love where it ended up. That it sort of like suggests the mythology that leads in with the kind of mythology of the standard American West. But in like later discussions with the art director, I think what we realized is that to me the characters are such a emotional core of the book that I sort of treated them as people. And so it's kind of like what sometimes happens when people see like the face of the character on their book. You're like, oh my God, it's not exactly how I imagined it in my head. And it was the same with the tigers. But we ended up working with this really amazing Asian American illustrator who did them. And I'm like really, really grateful. There are like so many hands, women and immigrants and like Asian Americans who just like had a huge part in the design of the book. And I'm really thrilled with it.
It's beautiful. Mm-hmm. Brit?
Yeah, well, I wanted to say first, I really loved Pam's cover. I remember the last time I was like one of the last days before the world ended in February. I was in the Riverhead offices and I was like, okay, I need a galley of this book based almost entirely on just how beautiful the cover of the book was. I think for myself, the title came late. I'd never know the title for anything.
Really?
It was like a collective. Yeah, it was. I don't think I came up with the title for the mothers either. I think that was like a collective effort. So it was a team effort. I don't know. I don't have the gift for titles. I just don't think I have it at this point. I've like accepted that. I just like as I was working, I just had like the document was just called Mallard as I was working on it, just like the name of the town of the book. So I just never really had a real title for this book. The title came late. It was a suggestion, I think, from my agent and my editor. We all kind of put our heads together, and that was the title we arrived at. And the cover, I think, is really vibrant and noticeable, and also I think it's quite disturbing. I've always found it to be a pretty unsettling cover because you have these faces that are blending together and you don't really know, like, is one of them kind of consuming the other? There's something, and there's like those bright primary colors that are clashing. So I found it to be a really interesting cover because I think that on its face, you kind of glance at it and you see these bright colors and it gives like that kind of vibrant sort of feeling. And then when you actually look at it, there is something unsettling about it, which I thought was really interesting. So grateful for how all of that came together, and grateful to have people around me who are better than I am at thinking of titles, and also obviously far better than I am at thinking of book covers or images for books.
Samira, how about you?
So I'm basically the opposite of Brit, which is I cannot start a book without having the title.
Okay.
I just feel, I don't know. I literally just have to sit down, and if I get an idea, usually a character comes to mind first, but then, so when I start taking notes, I have to have, I never start anything that says untitled. It just, I don't know, it doesn't feel right to me. So Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know and Internment were both the original titles I went with, but my first novel, Love, Hate, and Other Filters, was originally called Swimming Lessons.
Oh, wow.
And then
they're different.
Yes. And then another novel was coming out called Swimming Lessons, like a few months before mine or something. And so I got a call from my editor, like, okay, we got to switch this. So I did like another big brainstorm and sent like 50 title ideas. And my editor was like, this is a very good start. And I was like, and there's like a camera theme. And so that's where the filters came from. And then the word hate actually came from my editor and the publisher, because I had love and other filters. And they were like, what about love, hate, and other filters? And I was like, okay. I mean, it is weird. So because I choose the name in the beginning, it's strange to rename it, because it feels like, okay, my kid is 12 years old now. I'm going to switch your name.
Right. Interesting. We have a couple of questions from Facebook. This is one where I'm going to tell you the question, but I'm also going to give you an alternative in case you do not want to answer it. And everybody feels differently about talking about what they're doing next. If you would like to speak about what you're working on now, we'd love to hear it. If you'd like to take a pass on that question, you can tell us what it's been like to be on virtual book tour. Anybody? Samira, maybe you have a drawer full of titles waiting for you?
I have 50. I have 50 titles right here to share with everyone. So my next book, I do have a book coming out a year from now, but it hasn't been announced, so I can't really talk too much about it. It's based. I can say it's loosely based on kind of a lost, not totally lost, but somewhat forgotten Islamic epic, sort of like the Islamic Odyssey, a story told through the oral tradition. So that's what I'm working on right now. It does have a title.
There you go.
But also that also went brainstorm. That also was that required some title brainstorming because the title switched at the end.
Ah, there you go. Pam, how about you?
Well, I'm gonna say this, Samir. That sounds so exciting. I'm like upset that you can't tell us the title. Let's see about me. I guess like I'm very superstitious about talking about my next project. The only thing I will say is like it's the complete opposite of this one. I don't feel like I could ever write another book that's similar to the one I just wrote. I don't know. Virtual book tour has been like surprisingly heartwarming. Since this is my first book tour, I have 0 physical events to compare it with, but it's been really amazing just like having people send you little screenshots of like them watching you talk while they're gardening, while they're cooking dinner. I think there's something lovely about that because back in the world in which we could go to in-person events, I love them, but also at the same time, I could never stop thinking about how weird it is to be staring at someone who's looking at a book and staring at it and reading it. Like, where are you supposed to look? This is just like such a strange so now you don't have to figure out that part anymore.
That's true. There is something really sweet, the way that what used to be that, pictures that authors would take like on planes and showing where they've gone along their tour has become the screenshot of who they've talked to and where those people are and looking in the background of everybody's homes. Brit, can you tell us what you're working on?
Yeah, it's a book about 2 singers of a lifelong rivalry. So there's not really a title yet.
I have a few that you can use if you want.
There's just like such a like broad, vague thing that I'm calling it. That's not a real title, but that's just like I might as well just be calling it book at this point, really. But yeah, it's been fun. It's been fun to write a book that's set in a very different world than The Vanishing Half, and that's about music, which is something that I love and not like have no talent towards, but just appreciate. So that's been really fun to do, and yeah, so far it's a monstrously long book. So I don't know what to make of that, but I'm trying to find my way through it in a way that's not going to horrify my editor when I send her this draft that I wrote as I was like alone in my apartment for all these months during quarantine and just emerged with this, humongous stack of papers to just throw on her. So trying to get it into some place where it's not that, but that's what it currently is.
I can't wait to read book. It's going to be great.
I know. Book. I can't wait to see the cover of book. It's going to be amazing.
Somebody who is watching remotely wants to know, they say, I can see that all of you are sitting in front of your bookshelves. I would love to see what you have there, and perhaps you would be willing to mention a few favorites. And this person says, I see Stamped behind Samira. Right. Anybody want to give a plug for a book or two that you've loved recently that you would recommend to book clubs?
I just have a new anthology out, which is autumnal or Halloween-y. I gotta show this. It's right behind me. Because it's a little different for me. It's called Vampires Never Get Old. It's sort of like stories that sort of turn the sort of vampire mythology on its head a little bit. Tales with Fresh Bite is what they call it. And my story in there is called A Guidebook for the Newly Sired Desi Vampire. It's a second-person short story that guides new Indian or South Asian vampires into vampirehood.
That sounds like a really fun read.
Well, the other stories in there are just fantastic, and it's very Halloween-y.
Okay, hold it up again so we can see it. There we go, book clubbers. Take a look. There's your October book right there.
And it's great for any 12 and up. There's some stories that are a little scarier than others.
Okay, good to know. Pam, you disappeared. You must have gone to get something good to show us. What is it?
Yes. Okay, so I guess following this spooky theme, this is a short story collection called I Hold a Wolf by Years by Laura Philpott. She's one of my favorite short story writers. I don't know, she just does these things where she just touches upon like the eerie parts of human existence. And sometimes her stories have a little bit of a speculative or surreal twist that oftentimes are just like very normal, but they hold that same sort of mood in their hearts. Short stories I think are just really, really wonderful right now. And then another quick one I can give is for this book called 99 Nights of Logar by Jamil Mojang Kutai. And Samira, I actually thought of it when you were talking about your next project because this is a book that's sort of it's written by this Afghani American writer, and it's just told in this very like simple telling tradition.
Oh, so cool.
Apologizes like this quest that I think 4 or 5 young boys go on to like find a lost dog. It's just delightful, and the voice is just so spectacular.
Awesome. Brit, what do you recommend for us?
Yeah, most of the books behind me, honestly, are my friends' books because I feel like if I'm going to be on Zoom all day, then I might as well be plugging their books.
I do the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my product placement. I can't see my friends right now. So this is what I can offer in friendship. So the book right over my shoulder is A Gimmick by my friend Chris McCormick. And it's a book about this Armenian wrestler who becomes like this huge professional wrestler in the 80s in America and then just disappears. So it's a book that's about professional wrestling and the Armenian genocide in this fascinating way that delves into these questions of justice in this really beautiful, moving way. It's this kind of globe-trotting saga where you're going throughout the world and just thinking about these questions of justice and the ways in which professional wrestling, which is something I think, I never took it seriously, I will admit. But reading this book, you're reading how wrestling itself is kind of this performance of justice or injustice in this theatrical and way. So that's a book that I love by one of my really close friends. And another book I read recently was Feast Your Eyes by Milo Goldberg, which is a novel written in the form of an art catalog. So the author describes photographs that you don't actually get to see. She's just describing what is in these pictures and then you're reading about the life of the photographer who took them. So really beautiful, heartbreaking book, but written in a form that was really exciting to me to think of as a person who's writing about music right now. Like, how do you write about a form of art that the reader cannot actually access? So how do you write about a photograph that the reader will never see because it doesn't actually exist? So it was really brilliant and really heartbreaking book.
Sounds wonderful. For the aspiring writers in our audience, I wondered if each of you could talk a little bit about your path to here, whether you went to grad school or you have a full-time job at the same time that you're writing, or you had some, jobs right out of school that you wouldn't think would lead you to be a novelist, but somehow did. That's, for a lot of people I know, trying to visualize how do I go from being where I am right now and who I am right now to being like you, being somebody who has a novel out in the world is kind of hard to picture. And whoever wants to start first with this, feel free, but that would really be fun to hear.
Yeah, I actually love this question because I feel like we often don't talk enough about the pragmatic realities and obstacles to being a writer. So I will say that I feel like I spent my entire adult life trying to avoid the fate of being a writer because it's incredibly financially precarious. There's no job security. You don't know what's going on. It's expensive in the sense that no matter how large your book runs, you don't know how large the next one is going to be, and that is going to last you through so many years, right? So I actually, after college, I had a career working in tech in San Francisco, and I worked there full time for about 4 years until I sort of hit this breaking point, and I was in my mid-20s, and I was like, okay, I have these savings. I'm gonna move somewhere really cheap, which happened to be Bangkok, Thailand, and I am going to just try writing for a year and sort of see if anything comes of it. So that's the year that I wrote the first draft of this novel. I got accepted into an MFA program, and so I did go to an MFA program, but honestly, I would say that year of writing by myself investing myself was really a lot more formative to my craft. You don't need an MFA. No one needs it, except that it is, if you go to a fully funded one, a gift of time. And I still have a part-time day job. So I think that for me, I'm always, I come from like a low income family. I've never had that kind of financial stability in my life. And it's not shameful to have a job. It's not shameful to do other things. And the writing will always be there for me.
What is your part-time job?
I still work in tech. I'm a creative director.
Really? In what industry? In what business?
So I work for this like online skincare company. So it's completely unrelated, utterly unrelated. I think I prefer it that way instead of trying to have those parts of my life intersect.
Do you feel like you get to use kind of two different sides of your brain?
Oh, definitely. I mean, for one, just like having a job where my life is like Zoom meetings and I get to talk to people is so radically different from being alone by myself, like thinking about imaginary human beings.
It's good to have balance.
Yeah.
Real people, fake people you made up. Brit, what about you?
For me, I studied writing when I was an undergrad, and when I was graduating from college, it was the recession. So I decided just to apply for an MFA program because I didn't think I was really going to get a job anyways as an English major out in the world. So I applied, and the only place I got in was Michigan. So that was just where I went. And it wasn't a decision that I researched that closely, honestly. I was very, very fortunate that it worked out in the way that it did, that I got into a program that's funded. So for me, that was where I spent time finishing The Mothers. And I think for me, the advice I have is I totally agree with Pam. I think MFA programs can be worthwhile if they're funded and you don't have to go into huge amounts of debt to attend them. And I was very fortunate that Michigan gave me 3 funded years, which is why I spent the time to finish that book. But I think the other thing was I remember advice that I received once, which is just think of yourself as a writer and not necessarily pigeonhole yourself into thinking, well, I only write short stories or only write fiction or only write poems. Thinking of yourself holistically as a writer, because to me that was kind of the beginning of my public writing, was writing essays, and I never thought of myself as an essayist. The whole time I was working on this novel for all these years, I never thought that the first thing that would be published would be nonfiction, because I didn't think of myself as an essayist at all. But I was glad that I sort of ventured into that very different sort of side of the writer brain, because it led to me meeting my agent, and led to a lot of doors being open that I did not foresee. So I think that was advice that I received as a student that I found very helpful.
Thank you. Thanks. Samira?
So yeah, my path, I do like this question because every writer has a different path. And I think it's just so important for people to know that there's no one path to follow to get to your novel. So I never really wanted to be a writer when I grew up.
Really?
Yeah, like my top 3, like, you know how everyone asks you that, like when you're a kid, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And my top 3 were like ballerina, tennis player, and doctor. Ballerina, like for the tutus.
Right.
Tennis player, I was like in the 70s, I had a crush on Bjorn Borg. Yeah. I was like, this is the way I'm going to meet him, obviously. And doctor, because I'm Indian. So none of those 3 worked out. And I was an English major. I did not take any like creative fiction or creative writing classes in college. I did apply to one and was rejected. So and then I was a high school English teacher, and I worked in education nonprofits in New York City for a while. And I sort of just like to write on the side. I just kind of enjoyed it just for myself. Like I really liked writing sort of creative nonfiction essays, and occasionally I would take a class here or there, like, at the Y or at like Media Bistro or whatever, just to kind of be with some other writers and write stuff just for fun.
How long were you an English teacher?
7 years.
7 years.
Yeah, and I worked like another 8 years in nonprofit. And then I sort of like, I mean, like I always say to people, like, you know, there's no expiration date on your dreams. And so, you know, you can be an older person and have a dream. Although, I mean, basically I was like 40 and I was like, well, maybe I should try writing a book. I kind of had this idea. It's not leaving my head. Maybe I'm going to just try it. And, you know, I never had really knew how to write a book. So I was literally like Googling, like, how do you write a book? And then, you know, like researching all the, like, you know, I read a lot of books. I was obviously an English teacher. I taught writing and stuff. And then I sort of just over many years, just, you know, I was working a job. Then also I had like a couple kids. And then I was just sort of writing on the side and wrote this novel and then put it in the drawer, brought it out like 6 months later, would put it in the drawer for another year. So it took like 7 years or 8 years or whatever it was on that book. And that was my first book. That was Love, Hate, and Other Filters, my first book. So eventually I kind of got around to it. I just sort of stuck with it and the story wouldn't leave my mind. And I worked on it for a really long time to improve. I mean, the very first draft I ever wrote was 120,000 words. It was published at 65,000 words.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's like a whole other book, like right on my desktop, if anybody wants those extra 60,000 words. So I think that that was really sort of my training, I guess, like was just learning how to do that. You know, you learn sometimes the process of writing by writing.
Yeah. Yeah. I interviewed Dorothy Allison once and we were talking about this concept of having some kind of job that pays the bills while you're developing as a writer. And I was saying I used to work as a copywriter and it was, you know, obviously I'm not writing ad copy now, but just having deadlines and having someone edit you and just having to be constantly coming up with words was a great job for young me. And she said she recommends getting a job where you have access to free paper that you can steal and take home for your printer so that when you're writing at night, you can print out your drafts. And I was like, that's great advice right there. Somewhere with free office supplies. Yeah.
I mean, that's partially why I became a teacher. I was like, the school supplies alone.
Right. Genius. Before we wrap up, I have one last question for everybody, and that is about your relationship with readers. I know we all have relationships with readers in real life. That's what we're doing right now. We're talking with readers. But when you are writing, do you picture a specific reader? Are you writing to someone, whether that's an actual person you know or sort of a made-up ideal reader in your head? And Brit, I might start with you on that one.
You know, I think yes and no. I don't know that I have like an imagined ideal reader. But I think a thing that was really important for me when I was in my MFA program was, you know, I had a professor take me aside and ask me at one point, you know, who is it that you imagine reading this book? And I was like, well, Black women. And I don't know that I had ever really articulated that to myself before until I was directly asked. And to me, that was a really liberating moment of thinking that, of realizing that, you know, I heard Sadia Hartman speak once at, I think it was at the Brooklyn Book Festival last year. But she talked about the idea of both writing toward your community, but also writing with your community. And that was something that I actually really loved, the idea of writing towards your community, but also the idea of writing being collaborative with the reader in a way. And not in the sense of, you know, of sort of pandering to a reader or trying to appease what you think a reader wants from you. But just this idea of writing that's not just me as the writer talking at you, the reader, and you have to just sit there and listen to me talk at you. I love that idea of thinking about yourself as the writer as being in the community of your readers and also collaborating as you are making something with them. So that's just something that I do think about, and think about the idea of I don't want to write in a way that is me translating myself to some imagined reader who is so, you know, unthinkably different than myself. I want to think about my books, which are largely about the lives of Black women, and thinking about that this is the community I'm writing about, but also the community that I'm writing toward, and also the community that I'm writing with.
I love that, the idea of the community you're writing with. That's cool. Pam?
When I'm first writing a book, it can only be for myself. Like, I have to be very selfish when I write. I think that, like, because initially when you're writing, the project takes so many years that like in order to be fully committed to it, I only can please myself. Right? Like I have to find joy. I have to find joy in the words. I have to find joy in the way of it has to be joyful for myself. And I think that's partly like a response to the kinds of books that I like to write and that I also like to read. I really look for like a singularity in novels, despite the fact that yes, every story has been told a million times. I'm like really interested in like who are you? What is your perspective? How can you see this book like slightly at a slant, different than anyone else has ever seen it before? And I think I come to that partly because I wasted a chunk of years trying to write stories that were really like what I call my imitation white man stories. Like I wrote a bunch of terrible, like derivative stories that were like fake cheeser, fake carver. Like I would be writing up, people having dinner parties in like middle class white suburbs. Like I've never been to a dinner party in a middle class white suburb. So I think my current writing process is really like a response to that. But then that said, I think there are different processes. Like I really can only think of myself when I'm writing, and then as I sort of like start to think of revision, thinking about how sort of like logic pieces together, then my writer is definitely like Asian women, immigrants. Like I do think of them first, and then everyone else is sort of like in a secondary vein.
That makes sense. Samira?
I'm just thinking of Pam's short story of like a white middle-aged man, like just solving all of his problems with like 6 p.m. scotch, And anyway, I would maybe one day you'll write that to humor us to read it. I'm sure it would be great. But I think that a lot of us do that. There is that sort of, because that's what we read so much when we were growing up. So it's hard not to have that piece. So I guess for me, it's two-pronged. I mean, I think I'm a little bit like Pam, where I think of, I'm my first reader. And so I think that's just important for me as I am writing, I think. And, I also, I'm also writing for young adults. I mean, anyone can read YA, but it's also written for, teens, like 12 to 18-year-old kids, young people. And I think I don't imagine a certain ideal reader, but when you're writing YA, you are cognizant of who you're writing for, just as if you're writing middle grade, or, if you're writing a picture book, obviously you're cognizant of who that reader is going to be. And I do think, it's probably a longer conversation, but I do think it's interesting to think of like the ethics of being an author and that relationship with the reader. And so I'm always fascinated by sort of the idea of like implied author and implied reader and what that means and how that influences your writing. At the same time, my protagonists are, I share things with my protagonists in that they are Muslim and South Asian Americans, and, that code switching that you referenced. They're not me, but I have these commonalities with them. And so, when I was a kid growing up, there was no literature where characters look like me. And so I am aware of that when I'm writing my books. It's something, I really believe that every child deserves to see themselves as a hero on the page. And so that's something that it might not be something that I'm thinking about with every sentence, but it's in sort of
it's there.
Yes, it's in the atmosphere of how I write.
I love that. I wish we could keep talking, but we've finished up our hour, and I know there's more coming up in the festival this afternoon. So Brit, Pam, Samira, I want to thank you for giving us an hour of your time today from home. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
This has been fun. Everybody who's watching us from wherever you are, remember, until we get a donut button, there's just a donate button. So please donate a little something to the festival if you like, or buy all these wonderful books. Guys, if you have your books, feel free to hold them up. Buy these wonderful books from Parnassus. That's what helps keep the festival free and keeps you in plenty of good stuff to read. Thank you, everybody, so much. Bye.